Welcome to Borrowed Pain, stories that shrink your problems and expand your peace. Today we're traveling to 1590, when a governor returned home to find 115 colonists gone, vanished without a single body, a single clue, except for one mysterious word carved into a post. Settle in, and let's explore what happened. Imagine stepping off a ship after 3 long years away from home. 3 years of desperate waiting, of failed attempts, of storms and wars keeping you from the people you love most. You've crossed an ocean to return to a place that should be bustling with life, with your daughter, your infant granddaughter, your friends and neighbors. A small settlement carved from wilderness on the edge of the known world. But as your boat approaches the shore of Roanoke Island on this August day in 1590, something feels wrong. The silence hits you first. No voices calling out in greeting. No children running to the water's edge. No smoke rising from cooking fires. Just the sound of waves against sand and the wind moving through tall grass that's grown wild where gardens should be. This is the moment John White lived. And what he discovered that day would become one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. 115 people, gone without a trace. Let's go back to that moment. Let's walk with John White through the abandoned settlement and try to understand what happened to the lost colony of Roanoke. The journey from the ship to the shore must have felt endless. White had been the governor of this colony, responsible for these settlers. He left them here in 1587 with promises to return quickly with supplies. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of being blocked by war, by the Spanish Armada, by circumstances beyond his control. 3 years of knowing his daughter, Eleanor, and his granddaughter, Virginia, were here, waiting. As he stepped onto the beach, he would have been looking for signs of life, any indication that the settlement still existed. The fort should have been visible from the shore, a wooden palisade built to protect against threats, and it was still there, standing against the sky. But the gates hung open. No guards watched from the walls. White and his men called out as they approached. Their voices echoed back to them unanswered. Inside the settlement, they found something strange. This wasn't the scene of a sudden catastrophe. There were no bodies, no signs of a battle or struggle, no blood staining the ground. Instead, they found something almost more unsettling, evidence of an orderly departure. The houses had been carefully dismantled, not destroyed by fire or violence, but taken apart methodically, as if the colonists had salvaged the materials they would need elsewhere. Personal belongings remained scattered around the site, but not strewn about in panic. It looked as though people had sorted through their possessions, taking what mattered most and leaving the rest behind. White searched frantically through the ruins. He knew his daughter's house. He could picture her there, holding baby Virginia, waiting for his return. But the house was gone, broken down to bare timber. In one area, he found items that must have been deliberately buried, heavy iron objects that would be difficult to transport. They'd been hidden carefully, preserved as if the colonists planned to return for them someday. But it was what White found carved into wood that would echo through centuries. On a post at the entrance to the fort, someone had carved a single word in capital letters: Croatoan. The letters were clear and deliberate, cut deep into the wood with purpose, not scratched hastily in the dark of night. Whoever made this carving took their time. They wanted it to be found. They wanted it to be read. Nearby, on a tree at the edge of the settlement, were 3 letters, C-R-O. White knew immediately what this meant. Before he'd left 3 years earlier, they'd made an agreement. If the colonists needed to leave Roanoke, they would carve the name of their destination, and if they left under distress, under attack, or in danger, they would carve a Maltese cross above the name, a warning to anyone who came looking. There was no Maltese cross. This should have been good news. It meant they'd left by choice, not by force. They'd gone to Croatoan, an island to the south. The Croatoan people were friendly, allies of the English. White had known their chief, Manteo, who had traveled to England with earlier expeditions. If his daughter and granddaughter were with the Croatoan tribe, they might be safe. But standing there in the empty settlement, surrounded by the remnants of abandoned lives, White must have felt a crushing weight of uncertainty. Why had they left? When did they go? Were they still on Croatoan Island, or had they moved again? And perhaps most haunting of all, why had they left behind so many personal possessions? Among the scattered items, White found pieces that must have broken his heart. Small things that families cherish. Books that had been carried across an ocean. Tools needed for survival. Maps. His own belongings from when he'd lived there, now exposed to 3 years of weather and decay. The sun was setting as White and his men searched the site. Shadows grew long across the abandoned settlement. They'd need to return to the ship before dark, but White wanted to keep looking. Somewhere in this ghost town might be another clue, another message, something that would tell him more. But there was nothing else, just that one word. White was determined to sail south immediately to the island, to find his family, to learn what had happened. The ships prepared to set out, but that night, a violent storm rolled in from the ocean, the kind of storm that can tear ships apart and drown entire crews. The captains weighed anchor and struggled to keep their vessels from being destroyed. By the time the storm passed, their anchors were lost, their supplies damaged. The captains insisted they couldn't risk sailing to Croatoan in their condition. They needed to return to England or sail south to the Caribbean for repairs and provisions. They promised White they would return, that they would find his family. But John White would never see Roanoke again. He would never reach the island. He would never learn what happened to his daughter, his granddaughter, or the 113 other souls he'd left behind. He would die years later in Ireland, still haunted by that word carved in wood, still wondering. Croatoan. It's a word that raises more questions than it answers, a word that seems to promise an explanation while delivering only deeper mystery, a word that has captivated historians, archaeologists, and curious minds for more than 400 years. 115 people vanished from Roanoke Island. They left behind their homes, their possessions, and a single carved word. No bodies were ever found. No mass grave was ever discovered. They simply disappeared into the wilderness of the New World. To understand how this happened, we need to go back further, before the abandonment, before John White's departure. We need to understand why these colonists came to Roanoke in the first place, and what made them believe they could build a life on this remote island at the edge of English maps. This is the story of the lost colony, and it begins years before that word was carved. The first attempt. To understand why 115 people vanished from Roanoke, we need to go back 5 years earlier to when the English first tried to plant roots in this new world. It was 1585, and England was hungry for territory. Spain had claimed vast swaths of the Americas, building wealth from gold and silver mines, from sugar plantations, from trade routes that made kings rich beyond measure. Queen Elizabeth wanted her share. She wanted English flags flying over settlements in the New World. She wanted ports where English ships could resupply, territories that could send resources back home, and Most importantly, she wanted to challenge Spanish dominance. So that year, 5 ships left England carrying over 600 men. This wasn't a settlement expedition. It was a military operation disguised as colonization. The leader was Ralph Lane, a soldier and courtier who had experience with warfare, but none with building communities in wilderness. These weren't families coming to start new lives. They were mostly soldiers, adventurers, and gentlemen seeking fortune and glory. The fleet landed on Roanoke Island in the summer, and the men began constructing a fort. The island was small, just 12 miles long and 3 miles wide, covered in forests and marshland. It sat between the mainland of what we now call North Carolina and the barrier islands that protected it from the Atlantic Ocean. The location was strategic. Ships could anchor in the Sound, protected from ocean storms, and the island offered a defensive position. At first, things seemed promising. The Native Americans living in the region were initially curious and somewhat welcoming. The Roanoke people, the Croatoan, the Secotán, these were established communities who had lived on this land for generations. They had towns, agriculture, complex social structures, and trade networks. They knew this territory in ways the English couldn't begin to understand. The English explorers were fascinated by what they found. They documented plants they'd never seen before, animals unknown in Europe, vast forests full of timber, rivers teeming with fish. The soil seemed fertile. The climate was milder than England. In their letters and reports back home, they described a kind of paradise, waiting to be claimed. But the reality of survival was far more difficult than they'd anticipated. The soldiers expected to find gold, as the Spanish had in South America. They explored the mainland, pushing into territories where they weren't welcome, demanding information about precious metals from Native American communities who didn't appreciate armed foreigners making demands. They found no gold, no silver, no easy wealth waiting to be extracted. Worse, they'd arrived too late in the season to plant crops properly. They hadn't brought enough supplies to sustain 600 men through a winter. They depended on trading with the local tribes for food, corn, fish, game. But this created an impossible situation. The Native Americans had enough food for their own people, stored carefully to last through the cold months. They didn't have surplus to feed hundreds of English soldiers indefinitely. Ralph Lane made demands rather than requests. He viewed the Native Americans as subjects who should provide for English needs. He didn't understand, or didn't care, that he was asking communities to share food that meant the difference between their own survival and starvation. Tensions escalated through the winter. Small conflicts turned into larger confrontations. The English suspected the tribes of conspiring against them. The tribes, quite reasonably, were tired of feeding armed foreigners who contributed nothing and showed no signs of leaving. Trust eroded on both sides. By spring of 1586, the situation had become dangerous. Lane believed the tribes were planning an attack. Whether this was true or a paranoid interpretation of legitimate frustration, we'll never know for certain. But Lane decided to act first. He led a preemptive raid against Wingina, the chief of the Roanoke people who had initially welcomed them. Lane's men killed Wingina and others in a violent confrontation that shattered any remaining goodwill. The English were now surrounded by communities who had every reason to view them as hostile invaders. The fort on Roanoke Island had become more prison than settlement. Food was scarce. Disease had weakened many of the men. Morale was destroyed. They'd found no gold, established no profitable trade, built nothing permanent. The venture was a failure. When Sir Francis Drake arrived that June with a fleet of ships, fresh from raiding Spanish settlements in the Caribbean, Lane saw his escape. Drake offered to leave supplies and men to help the colony continue, But Lane had had enough. He and his surviving soldiers abandoned Roanoke and sailed back to England, leaving behind only the empty fort. The first English attempt to colonize Roanoke had lasted less than a year. It ended in violence, mistrust, and retreat. The soldiers returned home with no wealth, no glory, and a territory that now viewed English settlers as enemies to be driven out or destroyed. This was the context that John White inherited when he agreed to lead a second expedition just 1 year later. The island had a history now, a dark one. The tribes remembered what had happened. They remembered Ralph Lane and his soldiers. They remembered the broken promises and the violence. Yet somehow White convinced over 100 people, men, women, and children, to try again, to sail across an ocean to an island where the previous colonists had nearly starved and barely escaped with their lives, to build homes in a place where they would not be welcome. Why would anyone agree to this? What made them believe their attempt would be different? Perhaps it was because this time they were coming as families, not soldiers. They were bringing children, which signaled peaceful intentions. They planned to build a real community, homes, farms, workshops. They weren't looking for gold. They wanted land, opportunity, a fresh start in a new world. Or perhaps they simply didn't know the full truth of what had happened in 1585. Perhaps White, desperate to secure colonists, had downplayed the dangers. Perhaps he convinced them that Lane's military approach had been the problem, and that their civilian settlement would be different. Whatever their reasons, in the spring of 1587, 3 ships left England carrying 115 colonists to Roanoke Island. Among them was John White himself, appointed governor. His pregnant daughter Eleanor and her husband Ananias Dare, entire families betting their futures on a second chance. They were sailing toward an island that had already proven deadly, toward communities who had learned not to trust the English, toward a situation far more precarious than they understood. But they carried hope with them, the hope that this time would be different, that they could build something lasting, that they could make peace where others had made war. They had no way of knowing that within 3 years, all of them would be gone, that their settlement would stand empty, that their fate would become one of history's most enduring mysteries. The dream was about to become a nightmare, but first, there would be a brief, shining moment when anything seemed possible. A second chance. The voyage took over 2 months. 115 people packed into 3 small ships, crossing the Atlantic with all the possessions they could carry. Tools for building and farming, seeds for planting, supplies to last until they could establish themselves. Everything they owned fit into trunks and barrels stowed below deck. They arrived at Roanoke Island in late July, much later in the season than they'd planned. The original intention had been to stop at Roanoke only briefly, to check on 15 men left behind the previous year to maintain England's claim to the territory. Then the colonists would sail north to the Chesapeake Bay area, which had better soil and deeper harbors. But Simon Fernandez, the pilot of the fleet, refused to take them further. Whether this was due to the lateness of the season, conflict with White, or simply a desire to return to privateering, capturing Spanish ships for profit, we don't know. What we do know is that Fernandez forced the colonists to disembark at Roanoke and sailed away, leaving them on the island with no choice but to make it work. This was the first of many problems that would haunt the settlement. The fort built by Ralph Lane's expedition 2 years earlier was still standing, though overgrown and damaged by weather. The 15 men left to maintain it were nowhere to be found. The colonists searched the island and discovered their fate, at least partially. They found the bones of 1 man, but the other 14 had simply vanished. Whether they'd been killed, absorbed into local tribes or fled in a boat and drowned, no one could say. It was an ominous beginning. The colonists were now on an island where the previous occupants had disappeared without explanation. Still, they set to work. They needed to repair the fort before winter. They needed to build proper houses. They needed to plant crops, though it was already late in the season for that. They needed to establish relations with the surrounding tribes, a delicate task given what had happened during the Lane expedition. John White attempted diplomacy. He knew Manteo, a member of the Croatoan tribe who had traveled to England with earlier expeditions and had returned with the colonists. Manteo served as interpreter and intermediary. Through him, White tried to reach out to the local tribes to explain that this settlement was different, peaceful, family-oriented. But the tribes remembered. They remembered Ralph Lane. They remembered the violence. And just weeks after the colonists arrived, one of the settlers was killed, attacked and murdered while catching crabs alone near the shore. His name was George Howe, and his death sent shockwaves through the small community. The New World had drawn blood again. White organized a retaliatory raid against what he believed was a hostile tribe. But in the darkness, his men attacked the wrong village, one belonging to friendly natives who had helped them. More trust destroyed. More bridges burned. The colonists were surrounded by communities who now had fresh reasons to view them as dangerous. Yet life continued. The colonists repaired buildings, planted what they could, fished, and tried to establish routines. And on August 18th, 1587, something happened that gave them all hope. Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter. They named her Virginia, after the territory claimed by England. Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America. Her birth was celebrated by the entire colony. She represented their future, their commitment to this place. This wasn't a temporary military camp. This was home now. Children would be born here, families would grow, the settlement would endure. But even as they celebrated, reality was pressing in. Winter was coming. Their supplies were insufficient. The late arrival meant they'd missed most of the planting season. They had limited tools, limited food stores, and limited goodwill from the people who knew how to survive in this environment. The colonists held a meeting. They needed someone to return to England to secure more supplies, more tools, more settlers, to strengthen their numbers. It was a dangerous journey, months at sea, with no guarantee of safe passage or quick return. But it was necessary. They asked John White to go. White refused. He was the governor. His daughter and newborn granddaughter were here. How could he leave his family, his people, when they were so vulnerable? What kind of father abandons his child in a wilderness settlement? What kind of leader deserts his colony? But the colonists insisted. White had the connections in England, the credibility with investors. He knew the territory and could explain what they needed. He'd recruited them in the first place, so he was responsible for ensuring they survived. They gave him a written statement, absolving him of abandoning his post and making clear this was their decision, not his. Finally, reluctantly, White agreed. But before he left, they made an arrangement, one that would echo through centuries. If the colonists needed to leave Roanoke Island for any reason, they would carve the name of their destination in a prominent place. And if they left under duress, under attack, or in danger, they would carve a Maltese cross above the location name as a warning. It was a simple plan. A way for White to find them when he returned. A breadcrumb trail in case they needed to relocate. On August 27, 1587, just 9 days after his granddaughter's birth, John White boarded a ship and sailed away from Roanoke Island. He carried with him letters, requests for supplies, and the hopes of 115 people who were depending on his quick return. Standing on the shore, watching her father's ship disappear over the horizon, Eleanor Dare held baby Virginia close. Around her, the other colonists went about their work, preparing for winter, storing food, strengthening defenses. They were alone now in a strange land, surrounded by people who didn't trust them, facing a season they didn't fully understand. But they still had hope. White would return soon. They would survive the winter. By spring, new supplies would arrive, maybe even more settlers. They would make this work. They would build something lasting here. Virginia Dare was 9 days old, the youngest member of England's most ambitious colonial venture. She'd been born into a community that believed in its future, despite every warning sign telling them to leave. She was innocent of the dangers surrounding her, unaware of the tensions, the food shortages, the approaching winter, the hostile reception from tribes who'd been given every reason to drive the English into the sea. She was also, though no one could know it then, about to become part of the greatest mystery in American history. The dream was still alive in those final days before White's departure. 115 people living on Roanoke Island, working together, raising families, building homes. They believed they would endure. They believed this was just the beginning. They had no way of knowing they had less than 3 years before every trace of them would vanish. No way of knowing that John White would be trapped in England, unable to return, while they faced whatever came next alone. No way of knowing that their settlement would become a ghost town, abandoned except for a single word carved into wood. But that autumn of 1587, as White sailed east toward England, and the colonists prepared for their first winter, the future was still unwritten. Anything was possible. The dream survived. For now. Part 2. The Departure. The Impossible Choice. John White's ship arrived back in England in November of 1587 after a difficult Atlantic crossing. He'd been gone from Roanoke for just over 2 months, but already winter was setting in across Europe. He immediately began working to organize a relief expedition, gathering supplies, securing ships, recruiting additional colonists to strengthen the settlement. His plan was simple. Spend the winter preparing, then sail back to Roanoke in early spring of 1588. He'd be gone less than a year total. His daughter and granddaughter would receive the supplies they desperately needed. The colony would be reinforced and resupplied. Everything would work out. But John White had returned to an England on the brink of war. For years, tensions had been building between Protestant England and Catholic Spain. King Philip II of Spain was the most powerful monarch in Europe, controlling vast territories and wealth. Queen Elizabeth had been supporting Dutch rebels against Spanish rule, authorizing English privateers to attack Spanish ships and settlements, and generally making herself a thorn in Philip's side. Philip had finally had enough. He was assembling the largest invasion fleet the world had ever seen, the Spanish Armada. Over 130 ships carrying thousands of soldiers, with the singular purpose of invading England, deposing Elizabeth, and bringing England back under Catholic control. Every English ship that could float was being commandeered for the defense of the realm. Every sailor, every soldier, every resource was being directed toward the coming conflict. No one cared about a small colony on a distant island when Spanish warships were gathering across the Channel. White petitioned investors, appealed to officials, pulled every string he could reach. He explained that the colonists were vulnerable, that they needed help before winter truly set in. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. England was facing an existential threat. The colony would have to wait. Imagine being in White's position. He'd left his pregnant daughter, who had since given birth, on a remote island with limited supplies. He'd promised to return quickly. The colonists were depending on him, and now he was being told that his family, his responsibility, his colony, was simply not a priority. Winter passed. White continued his efforts, but the situation only worsened. By spring of 1588, all of England was preparing for the Spanish invasion. Coastal defenses were being strengthened. The English Navy was mobilizing. Merchant ships were being converted into warships. There was no possibility of organizing a supply mission to America. In July of 1588, the Spanish Armada finally appeared off the English coast. 130 ships carrying the might of the Spanish Empire. The largest naval invasion force ever assembled. For days, English ships harried the Spanish fleet as it moved up the channel toward its planned rendezvous with Spanish troops in the Netherlands. The English used smaller, more maneuverable ships to their advantage. They sent fire ships. Vessels set ablaze and sailed into the Spanish formation, creating chaos. They attacked when the wind favored them, then retreated before the Spanish could bring their superior numbers to bear. And then the weather turned against Spain. A massive storm scattered the Spanish fleet. Ships were driven onto rocks, others were blown far off course into the North Atlantic. The invasion was broken not by military might alone, but by what the English called the Protestant wind. Divine intervention, they believed, saving England from Catholic conquest. The Armada limped home, defeated. Spain had lost over half its ships and thousands of men. England was safe. Elizabeth's reign was secure. But for John White, the defeat of the Armada meant only one thing. He'd lost another year. It was late 1588 now. He'd been gone over a year. His daughter and granddaughter had faced a winter alone. Baby Virginia would be over a year old now, walking, perhaps beginning to talk, growing up without her grandfather, who'd promised to return quickly with help. White renewed his efforts with desperate urgency. He secured promises of ships and supplies for a spring 1589 departure. Finally, it seemed, he would be able to return. But the investors backing him wanted profit, not just charity. The ships would stop to raid Spanish vessels on the way. Privateering was lucrative business. White agreed to anything that would get him back to Roanoke. In March of 1589, the expedition finally set sail. White must have felt a tremendous relief. He was going home. After all the delays, all the obstacles, he would finally see his family again. 2 years had passed, but he was on his way. The expedition was a disaster. The ships encountered Spanish and French vessels off the coast of Morocco. Rather than avoiding conflict and continuing to Virginia, the English captains engaged in battle. They were defeated, badly. The English ships were damaged, supplies were lost, and men were killed or wounded. The captains decided the expedition was no longer viable. They turned back to England. White never even made it across the Atlantic. He came within days of reaching Roanoke, and then the opportunity slipped through his fingers. He returned to England, having been gone for months, with nothing to show for it except more time lost. By now, it was late 1589, over 2 years since he'd left Roanoke. 2 winters his family had endured without the supplies he'd promised. 2 years of vulnerability, of struggle, of wondering if he'd abandoned them or simply died at sea. White's anguish must have been unbearable. He'd tried everything. He'd exhausted his resources, his connections, his credibility. The investors who'd funded the original colony had moved on to other ventures. The political situation meant colonial expeditions were a low priority. His family was alone in the wilderness, and he couldn't reach them. He continued to petition anyone who would listen. He wrote letters describing the plight of the colonists. He emphasized that these were English subjects, families with children who deserved rescue. But the harsh reality was that in the grand scheme of international politics and profit, one small, struggling colony simply didn't matter. Through 1589 and into 1590, White persisted. And finally, after exhausting every other option, he managed to secure passage on a privateering expedition headed toward the Caribbean. The ships would be passing near the outer banks of Carolina. The captain agreed to make a stop at Roanoke, a brief detour, nothing more. White could check on the colony, deliver what few supplies he could carry, and see his family. It wasn't the relief expedition he'd envisioned. It wasn't the fleet of supply ships and reinforcements the colonists needed, but it was something. After 3 years of obstacles and failures, John White was finally going back to Roanoke. The ships departed England in March of 1590. The journey took months. They stopped in the Caribbean to raid Spanish settlements and capture prizes. Every delay must have been agony for White. Every decision to chase another Spanish ship, to spend another week at some port, meant more time away from his family. But finally, in August of 1590, the ships approached the outer banks of Carolina. White stood on deck, watching the familiar coastline appear. 3 years. He'd been gone 3 years. Virginia would be 3 years old now. Eleanor would have been living without word from him for so long she might have thought him dead. What would he find when he landed? How had the colony fared? Had they survived the winters? Had they made peace with the local tribes? Had they built something sustainable in his absence? On August 15th, the ships anchored off the coast. It was late afternoon. Smoke was visible rising from Roanoke Island, a promising sign. Smoke meant fires, which meant people. White's hopes surged. They were still there. The colony had survived. The crew waited for morning to approach the shore. As darkness fell, they saw more fires on the island. White and his men called out across the water, announcing their arrival. They played English tunes on a trumpet, hoping the colonists would hear and recognize friendly sounds. They wanted to avoid any confusion, any chance that the colonists would mistake them for enemies approaching in the night. There was no response from the island, just the fires burning in the darkness and the sound of waves against the shore. The next morning, August 16th, they prepared boats to row ashore. But before they could launch, one of the boats capsized in the rough surf, drowning several men. It was a grim reminder of how dangerous this coast was, how the barrier islands and shifting sandbars had claimed countless vessels over the years. They finally made it to shore and began the march toward the settlement. White's heart must have been pounding. After 3 years of obstacles, delays, and failed attempts, he was about to see his family. About to reunite with his daughter and meet the granddaughter who'd been born just days before he sailed away. About to deliver the supplies and help the colonists so desperately needed. The fires they'd seen from the ship turned out to be brush fires, not cooking fires. Natural blazes started by lightning, not human hands. Still, White pressed forward. The settlement was just ahead. Through the trees and overgrown paths, he could see the fort. And as he got closer, the silence registered. No voices, no sounds of work or life. No children playing. No one calling out greetings. Just a silence, and the wind moving through tall grass that had grown wild in the abandoned settlement. John White was about to discover what 3 years of absence had cost him. He was about to find an empty colony and a single word carved in wood, a word that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But in these final moments of hope, before he saw the abandoned houses and the empty fort, he still believed he would find them. He still believed his impossible journey would have a happy ending. He was wrong. 3 years of hell, The timeline of John White's absence reads like a catalog of misfortune. Every attempt to return blocked, every plan derailed, every promise broken by circumstances beyond his control. 3 years stretched ahead of him like an endless nightmare from which he couldn't wake. When White arrived back in England in November 1587, winter was already closing in. He spent those cold months in a frenzy of activity, writing letters, meeting with investors, securing commitments for supplies. He needed ships, provisions, more colonists to strengthen the settlement. He worked tirelessly through December and January, believing that by early spring he'd be sailing back to Roanoke. But as winter turned to spring in 1588, the political situation in England darkened. Word came from the continent that Spain was building a massive fleet. Not just a few warships, but hundreds of vessels. An armada unlike anything the world had seen. Its purpose was singular and terrifying: invade England, overthrow Queen Elizabeth, and restore Catholic rule. Every ship in England was suddenly precious. Every vessel that could carry soldiers or supplies, every captain with experience at sea, every naval resource was being directed toward the defense of the realm. The Queen's officials began commandeering merchant ships, converting them for military use. Private expeditions were canceled. Crews were conscripted into the Navy. White's planned relief expedition was swept away in the tide of war preparation. His protests meant nothing. What was one small colony compared to the survival of England itself? The officials were sympathetic, but firm. The colony would have to wait. There was no choice. White watched spring arrive, the season when he'd promised to return, knowing his daughter and granddaughter were waiting for supplies that wouldn't come. He imagined Eleanor standing on the shore, watching for sails that never appeared. Baby Virginia, who'd been 9 days old when he left, was now 6 months, 7 months, 8 months old, growing up without him. And he was trapped, helpless, while an entire nation prepared for war. In July 1588, the Spanish Armada appeared off the English coast. For days, the outcome hung in balance. English ships were faster, more maneuverable, but the Spanish had overwhelming numbers. The English harried the Spanish fleet up the channel, attacking when the wind favored them, sending fire ships into their formations to create chaos. And then nature intervened. A violent storm scattered the Spanish fleet, driving ships onto rocks, blowing others far into the North Atlantic. The invasion was broken. England was saved. Elizabeth's throne was secure. But for John White, this victory meant only that he'd lost an entire year. It was now August 1588. He'd been gone a full year. The colonists had faced a complete winter cycle without the supplies he'd promised. They'd rationed whatever they'd brought with them, supplemented by what they could hunt, fish, or trade for. Had it been enough? Were they still alive? The questions must have tormented him through the autumn of 1588. With the immediate Spanish threat ended, surely now he could organize a relief mission. But England was exhausted from the conflict. Ships needed repairs, resources were depleted, and investors had lost money during the war. They were reluctant to fund risky colonial ventures when the political situation remained unstable. White spent another winter in England, pleading his case to anyone who would listen. He emphasized the human element. These were families, women and children, English subjects who deserved rescue. But the cold mathematics of early colonial economics worked against him. The original investors had poured money into the venture and seen no return. The colony had produced no profitable goods, no valuable exports. From a business perspective, sending more resources after the first investment was throwing good money after bad. Finally, in early 1589, White managed to secure backing for an expedition. The terms weren't ideal. The ships would engage in privateering along the way, raiding Spanish and French vessels for profit. But White agreed to anything that would get him back to Roanoke. In March of 1589, the ships finally set sail. White must have felt overwhelming relief as England's coast disappeared behind him. After all the delays, all the obstacles, he was finally going back. 17 months had passed since he'd left. Virginia would be walking now, maybe saying her first words. Eleanor would have survived one full winter. Soon he'd see them again. But the expedition was doomed from the start. Off the coast of Morocco, the English ships encountered French vessels. Instead of avoiding conflict and continuing to Virginia, the English captains saw an opportunity for profit. They engaged in battle. The fight went badly. The English ships were damaged, supplies were lost or ruined, men were killed or wounded. The captains assessed the situation and made their decision. The expedition could not continue. They were too damaged, too undersupplied, too weakened. They turned back toward England. White protested desperately. They were already across the Atlantic's eastern edge. Roanoke wasn't that much further. They could still make it, even damaged. But the captains wouldn't risk their ships and crews for a struggling colony that might not even still exist. They sailed back to England. In summer of 1589, White found himself back where he'd started, having achieved nothing except losing more time. He'd been gone from Roanoke for nearly 2 years now, 2 winters, 2 full cycles of seasons. His family had been waiting for him for 2 years, and he'd failed to reach them yet again. The psychological toll must have been devastating. White had been a respected artist and cartographer. He'd been chosen to govern the colony because people believed in his vision. Now he was seen as the man who'd abandoned his colonists, who couldn't organize a simple relief mission. The fact that the obstacles were largely beyond his control didn't matter. The colony was stranded, and he was in England, unable to help them. Through late 1589 and into 1590, White became increasingly desperate. His resources were nearly exhausted. His credibility was damaged. The investors who'd backed the original colony had moved on to other ventures. He was a man with no leverage, no influence, begging for help that no one wanted to provide. Finally, he found a last option. A privateering expedition was being organized to raid Spanish settlements in the Caribbean. The route would take them past the outer banks of Carolina. White begged the captain to make a brief stop at Roanoke. Just a few hours to check on the colony. And that's all he asked. The captain agreed, perhaps out of pity. White could come along and take the detour. But this wouldn't be a proper relief expedition. White could bring only what he could carry in his personal baggage. There would be no fleet of supply ships, no reinforcements, no grand rescue. Just a brief stop on the way to more profitable ventures. It was something. After nearly 3 years of failure, John White had finally secured a way back to Roanoke. It wasn't what the colonists needed, but at least he'd be able to see his family, assess their situation, perhaps bring a few critical supplies. The ships departed England in March of 1590. The journey took months, with stops throughout the Caribbean for raiding Spanish settlements. Every delay was torture for White. Every week spent chasing prizes or resting in port was another week his family waited. But finally, in August of 1590, 3 years and 1 week after he'd sailed away, John White approached the outer banks of Carolina. He stood on the deck watching the familiar coastline appear through the heat haze of late summer. 3 years. Virginia would be 3 years old. Eleanor would be 24. What would they look like? How had they changed? What had those 3 years cost them? What had they endured while he fought through obstacles on the other side of the ocean? Had they given up hope of his return? Did they think he'd abandoned them? Soon he would know. The ships were dropping anchor. Boats were being prepared. Within hours, he would step onto Roanoke Island and see what 3 years of isolation had done to his colony. He expected to find them struggling but alive, thin perhaps, weathered by hard winters, but alive. His family would be there. The colonists would be there. He'd finally made it back. He had no way of knowing that he was arriving at a ghost town, that 3 years of hell for him would turn out to be nothing compared to the mystery waiting on that island. The worst was still ahead. Part 3. The Discovery. The Return. August 15th, 1590. The ships anchored off the coast of Roanoke Island in the late afternoon. John White stood on deck, straining his eyes toward the shore, toward the island where his family waited. 3 years. 3 long years since he'd seen his daughter, since he'd held his newborn granddaughter. 3 years of obstacles and failures and broken promises. But now, finally, he was here, and then he saw it. Smoke rising from the island, thin columns of gray against the summer sky. White's heart must have leaped. Smoke meant fires. Fires meant people. The colony was still there. They'd survived. After all his fears, all his nightmares about what might have happened, they were alive. The crew wanted to wait until morning to approach the shore. The waters around these barrier islands were treacherous, full of shifting sandbars and hidden obstacles. Approaching in darkness was asking for disaster. But as night fell, they saw more fires burning on Roanoke. The sight was encouraging. Mysterious, perhaps, why so many fires, but encouraging. White and his men called out across the water, their voices carried over the waves, announcing their arrival. They played English tunes on a trumpet, familiar melodies that any English colonist would recognize. They wanted the settlers to know friends were approaching, not enemies. They wanted to avoid any tragic misunderstanding in the darkness. They listened for a response, some answering call, some signal that their voices had been heard. But there was only the sound of water against the ship's hulls, the creak of timber, the whisper of wind. The fires burned on the island, but no one answered their calls. Still, White felt hope. They would land in the morning. The colonists were probably asleep, or perhaps they were being cautious about revealing themselves to unknown ships in the darkness. By daybreak, everything would be clear. He would see Eleanor. He would meet Virginia, who was now 3 years old. A child, not an infant. So much time lost. But soon, he would hold them again. The night passed slowly. White probably didn't sleep watching those fires burn through the darkness, imagining the reunion ahead. Morning came. August 16th, 1590. The crew prepared boats to row ashore. White gathered the few supplies he'd been able to bring, not nearly enough, but something. Everything else would have to wait for a proper relief expedition. At least now he could assess what the colony needed most urgently. As they prepared to launch the boats, disaster struck. One of the boats capsized in the rough surf near the shore. Men were thrown into the churning water. Some struggled to safety. Others were pulled under by the weight of their equipment and clothing, or were battered against the hidden sandbars. Captain Spicer and 6 sailors drowned before anyone could reach them. It was a horrific start to the landing. White stood on the beach, watching men's bodies being pulled from the water, and the omen couldn't be ignored. These waters had claimed lives before. They would claim more. This was a dangerous coast, and they'd just been reminded why so few ships ventured here. But White pressed forward. They'd come too far, waited too long. He organized the remaining men and began the march inland toward the settlement. The path was overgrown. Plants had reclaimed the trail that should have been kept clear by regular use. That was troubling, but White pushed the concern aside. Maybe the colonists had simply been too busy to maintain the paths. Maybe they'd established gardens elsewhere. There could be innocent explanations. The fires they'd seen from the ship turned out to be natural brush fires, not cooking fires. Lightning strikes had ignited the dry grass, and the flames had spread across sections of the island. No human hands had set those fires. White felt the first real stirring of fear. But he walked on. The settlement was just ahead. And then, through the trees, he saw the fort. The wooden palisade Ralph Lane's expedition had built 5 years earlier, repaired and maintained by his colonists. It was still standing. The walls were intact, but the gate hung open. White called out. His voice echoed across the empty settlement. He called again, louder. Surely someone would hear. Surely Eleanor would recognize her father's voice and come running. Surely Virginia, curious and 3 years old, would peek out from behind her mother's skirts. No one answered. White entered the fort, his men following cautiously behind. Inside the palisade, they found an eerie scene. This wasn't the aftermath of a battle or sudden catastrophe. There were no bodies, no blood staining the ground, no signs of fire damage or violent destruction. Instead, they found something that was somehow more unsettling, evidence of careful, deliberate abandonment. The houses had been dismantled, not destroyed, but taken apart methodically. The timbers had been removed, likely salvaged for use elsewhere. The structures White remembered, the homes where families had lived, the workshops where colonists had practiced their trades, the communal buildings where they'd gathered, were gone. Only the foundations remained, along with scattered debris. Personal belongings were strewn around the site, but not scattered in panic. It looked like people had sorted through their possessions, taking what they needed and leaving behind what was too heavy or too cumbersome to carry. There were tools, some broken, some simply abandoned, pieces of armor, books damaged by 3 years of exposure to the elements, household items that families had carried across an ocean, now left to rust and decay. White searched desperately for anything familiar. He found the area where he believed Eleanor's house had stood, but there was nothing left except bare ground and a few scattered items that might have been hers. He picked through the debris with shaking hands, looking for some sign, some message, something that would tell him what had happened to his daughter and granddaughter. In one area, his men discovered items that had been deliberately buried, heavy iron objects, bars, and tools that would be difficult to transport. They'd been carefully hidden, preserved, as if the colonists intended to return for them someday. That suggested planning, not panic. It suggested the settlers had made a conscious decision to leave and had taken steps to protect valuable resources they couldn't carry. But why leave it all? Where had they gone, and when? White walked through the abandoned settlement as the sun climbed higher, illuminating every detail of the ghost town. He examined every corner, every remaining structure, every piece of debris. He was looking for bodies, though he dreaded finding them. The absence of human remains was both a relief and a deeper mystery. If the colonists had died from disease or starvation, there would be graves. If they'd been attacked and killed, there would be remains. The complete absence of bodies suggested they'd left alive. But left for where? Then White saw it. Carved into a post at the right side of the entrance to the fort. Letters cut deep and clear into the wood, about 5 feet from the ground where they couldn't be missed. Capital letters, carefully formed, deliberate, and purposeful. Croatoan. White stood before the carving, reading and rereading the word. His heart was pounding. This was the signal they'd agreed upon. If the colonists needed to leave, they would carve their destination. And here it was. Croatoan. He looked for the Maltese cross that would indicate distress, that would tell him they'd left under attack or in danger. But there was no cross, just the word, clean and clear. Croatoan. This should have been good news. The colonists had followed the plan. They'd left a clear message. And they'd gone to Croatoan Island, home to the native tribe, Monteo's people, who had been friendly to the English. If the colonists were with the Croatoans, they might be safe. They might have been absorbed into the tribe, living peacefully, surviving. But standing in the empty fort, surrounded by abandoned possessions, and the silence of a dead settlement, White felt no relief. Only questions multiplied. When had they left? Why? What had driven them to abandon everything they'd built? Were they still on the island, or had they moved again? Were they alive? White continued searching and found another carving. On a tree near the shore, someone had carved 3 letters, C-R-O. Perhaps the beginning of the word, or perhaps a marker pointing the direction they'd gone. Either way, it reinforced the message. Croatoan. That was where they'd gone. But why had they left behind so many possessions? The dismantled houses made sense. They'd salvaged the timber. The buried iron made sense, too heavy to carry far. But other items seemed strange to abandon, tools that would be useful anywhere. Books that families treasured, personal items that had crossed an ocean with them. White examined the carvings again. The letters were weathered, but still clear. They'd been carved months ago, certainly. Perhaps a year or more. The wood around them showed exposure to multiple seasons. This wasn't recent. The colonists had been gone for a long time. How long? White had no way to know. They could have left shortly after he'd sailed away 3 years ago. They could have survived 1 winter, or 2, before finally deciding to relocate. They could have left last month. The empty settlement gave no answers, only more questions. White's men spread out across the site, looking for anything else that might provide information. They found the remains of the palisade where Lane's original fort had stood, now overgrown but still visible. They found gardens that had long since gone wild, overrun with weeds and native plants. They found a few scattered artifacts, a shoe, some pottery shards, a rusted knife. But they found no recent evidence of human habitation, no fresh cooking fires, no newly discarded items, no signs that anyone had been here recently. The settlement had the feeling of a place abandoned long ago, reclaimed by nature, becoming part of the forest again. As the day wore on, White's desperation grew. He ordered his men to search the entire island. Perhaps the colonists had moved to a different part of Roanoke, not to Croatoan at all. Perhaps the carving was old, from an earlier plan they'd later changed. Perhaps there was another message somewhere else on the island. They searched until dusk. They found nothing. No other settlements, no other signs of English habitation. No graves, no additional messages. Just the forest and the marshes and the silent shore. As darkness fell, White returned to the fort and stood before the carved word one more time. Croatoan. 7 letters that were both an answer and a question. His family had gone there, or at least that's what the carving said. But when? In what condition? Were they still there? Had they been welcomed by the Croatoan tribe, or had something else happened? White made his decision. They would sail to the island immediately. It was south of Roanoke, along the outer banks. They could reach it quickly. He would find his family there. He would find the colonists. This mystery would be solved. But even as he made these plans, Doubt gnawed at him. 3 years. He'd been gone for 3 years. So much could happen in 3 years. The colonists could have integrated with the native tribe and moved elsewhere. They could have split into groups, some going to Croatoan, others heading inland. They could have faced disease, starvation, violence. The word carved in the post guaranteed nothing except that at some point in the past, the colonists had intended to go to Croatoan. White returned to the ships that night, exhausted and shaken. He'd imagined this reunion 1,000 times during the 3 years of obstacles and delays. He'd pictured Eleanor's face when she saw him. He'd imagined holding Virginia, who would be shy at first, not recognizing the grandfather she'd never really known. He'd pictured the colonists' relief at his arrival, even if he'd brought insufficient supplies. At least they'd know they hadn't been forgotten. Instead, he'd found an empty settlement, houses dismantled, possessions abandoned, and one word carved in wood promising answers while delivering only more questions. That night, as the ships rocked at anchor off Roanoke Island, White must have replayed everything in his mind. Every detail of the abandoned settlement, every item left behind, the careful dismantling of the houses, the buried iron, the absence of bodies, which suggested the colonists had left alive but raised the question of why they'd left at all. Tomorrow they would sail to Croatoan. Tomorrow, perhaps, he would find his family. Tomorrow the mystery might be solved. But tonight, John White lay awake on a ship anchored off a ghost island, haunted by 7 letters carved into wood, and by the terrible silence of a settlement that should have been full of life. Croatoan. The word that was supposed to be a solution had become the heart of the mystery itself, and White had no way of knowing that he would never solve it, that the next day would bring not answers, but only more obstacles, that he would never see his daughter or granddaughter again, that the mystery of the lost colony would remain unsolved for centuries to come. But that was tomorrow's tragedy. Tonight, there was still hope. Faint, fragile hope that Croatoan Island would provide the answers that Roanoke had denied him. Hope was all he had left. What happened? John White woke on August 17th with a plan. The ships would sail south to Croatoan Island. It wasn't far, perhaps 50 miles down the Outer Banks. They could be there by evening. He would find the colonists living with Manteo's people. He would find Eleanor and Virginia. The word carved into the post had told him where to go. Finally, after 3 years, he would have answers. The morning began with preparations. The ships needed to weigh anchor, check their supplies, ready themselves for the short journey. White paced the deck, impatient with every delay. He'd waited 3 years. Every additional hour felt unbearable. But as the crew worked, the weather began to change. The sky, which had been clear at dawn, started filling with clouds rolling in from the Atlantic. The wind picked up, shifting direction unpredictably. The captains exchanged concerned glances. They knew these waters. They knew how quickly conditions could deteriorate. By midday, the decision was made. They couldn't risk sailing to Croatoan in deteriorating weather. These barrier islands were surrounded by treacherous shoals and sandbars. The channels between islands shifted with every storm. Attempting to navigate in bad weather, especially to an unfamiliar anchorage, would be suicidal. They'd already lost 7 men in the surf at Roanoke. The captains wouldn't risk the entire expedition. They would wait for the weather to clear. Then they would sail to Croatoan. It was a delay of hours, perhaps a day at most. White agreed reluctantly. He'd waited 3 years. He could wait 1 more day. But the storm that hit that night was unlike anything they'd anticipated. The wind howled across the water, driving massive waves against the ships. Rain came in sheets so thick visibility dropped to nothing. The vessels strained at their anchors, pitching violently in the turbulent water. Crew members worked frantically to keep the ships from being driven onto the shore or torn apart by the wind. The storm raged through the night and into the next day, then another night. The ships were battered relentlessly. Water leaked through the hulls. Rigging was damaged. And most critically, the anchors began to drag. The ships were being pushed toward the dangerous shoals that surrounded the islands. On the second day of the storm, disaster struck. The cables holding the anchors snapped. The ships were now drifting at the mercy of wind and current, in waters filled with submerged hazards that could tear through a wooden hull in seconds. The captains had no choice but to try to sail clear of the immediate danger, to get the vessels into deeper water where they could ride out the storm. By the time the weather finally broke, the ships were far from Roanoke. They'd been driven north and east, away from the barrier islands, out into the open Atlantic. And when the captains assessed the damage, the news was grim. They'd lost their anchors, all of them. The ships had sustained damage to their hulls and rigging. Their supplies of fresh water were dangerously low. Their food stores had been damaged by seawater. White begged them to return to the islands, to sail back to Croatoan, to complete the mission. They'd come so far. His family was so close, just 50 miles south. One day of sailing. He pleaded with the captains to give him that one day, but the captains refused. Without anchors, they couldn't safely approach the barrier islands again. The waters were too shallow, too unpredictable. They'd need to drift offshore and send boats in through the surf. But after losing 7 men that way already, and with the ships damaged and supplies low, the risk was too great. The expedition was over. They needed to either return to England immediately or sail south to the Caribbean to resupply and repair the ships. The ship owners, the merchants who'd funded this privateering voyage, chose the Caribbean. There was still profit to be made raiding Spanish settlements. They would sail south, repair the ships, take on provisions, and continue their profitable work. White could stay with them or return to England on another vessel, but they would not be returning to the Carolina coast. White had no leverage, no authority, no way to force them to change course. He was a passenger on someone else's expedition, dependent on their goodwill. And that goodwill had reached its limit. The storm had decided the matter. He would not be going to Croatoan Island. He would not be finding his family. Not now, not on this trip. As the ships sailed south, away from the Outer Banks, away from Croatoan Island, away from any hope of finding the colonists, White stood on the deck watching the coastline disappear. He'd been within 50 miles of his destination. One day's sail, a few hours in the right conditions, and nature had intervened to deny him once again. The cruelty of it must have been overwhelming. 3 years of obstacles. 3 years of being blocked by war, by investors, by storms, by circumstance. He'd finally reached Roanoke. He'd found the message telling him where the colonists had gone. The mystery had seemed solved. And then, at the last moment, when he was closer than he'd been in 3 years, another storm had torn that solution away from him. White sailed to the Caribbean with the expedition. He harbored hopes that after resupplying and repairing, the ships might return to Croatoan. But as weeks turned to months, it became clear that wouldn't happen. The captains had other priorities. The merchants wanted profit, not rescue missions. Eventually, White booked passage back to England, defeated and heartbroken. He arrived home in late 1590, nearly 3.5 years after leaving Roanoke. He'd seen the abandoned settlement. He'd found the carved word. He'd been within reach of potentially finding his family. and he'd been forced to leave without answers. White spent his remaining years trying to organize another expedition. He wrote letters, he petitioned officials, he appealed to anyone who might fund a return voyage. But he was an old man now, exhausted by years of struggle and disappointment. His credibility was gone. His resources were depleted. No one would back another attempt. The mystery of what happened to the colonists consumed him. He had the one clue, Croatoan, but no way to follow it. He'd seen the abandoned settlement with his own eyes, but he couldn't interpret what it meant. Had the colonists integrated peacefully with the Croatoan tribe? Had they moved somewhere else? Had they survived at all? The questions haunted him. At night, he must have replayed every detail of that empty settlement. The dismantled houses, the buried iron, the personal belongings left behind, the single word carved in wood. What had Eleanor been thinking when she left? Had she believed her father would find the message and come for them? Had she given up hope of his return? Had she thought him dead? And Virginia? 3 years old when he'd found the empty settlement. Old enough to walk and talk and recognize faces. But she'd been an infant when he left. She would have no memory of her grandfather. To her, he would be a stranger, a figure from stories her mother told, if she was even still alive. White never learned the answers. He died in Ireland, probably in the early 1590s, still wondering what had happened to the lost colony. His final written record about the colony dates from 1593, a letter to the publisher of his writings in which he mentions his uncomfortable and troublesome experience at Roanoke. The tone is resigned, exhausted. He'd given up hope of ever finding them. The colonists, all 115 of them, had vanished into the wilderness of the New World. They'd left behind an abandoned settlement, some scattered possessions, and a single carved word that raised more questions than it answered. No bodies were ever found. No mass grave was ever discovered. No definitive evidence of their fate ever emerged. The word Croatoan should have been the end of the mystery. It should have pointed searchers in the right direction. But no one followed that lead for years. By the time other English expeditions returned to the region, memories had faded. The Croatoan tribe had moved or merged with other groups. The trail, if there ever was one, had gone cold. What happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? The question has echoed through more than 4 centuries of American history. It's become one of the nation's most enduring mysteries, a historical puzzle that has captivated generations of historians, archaeologists, and curious minds. Standing in that empty settlement on August 16th, 1590, John White couldn't have known that he was witnessing the birth of a legend. He couldn't have known that the word Croatoan would be repeated and analyzed and debated for centuries. He couldn't have known that his lost colony would become America's first great unsolved mystery. He knew only that his family was gone, that he had failed them, and that he would spend his remaining days haunted by 7 letters carved into wood and by the terrible silence of an abandoned settlement where laughter and life should have been. The discovery of the empty colony was not an ending. It was a beginning. The beginning of a mystery that continues to this day, because the colonists didn't simply vanish. They went somewhere. They did something. They survived or they died, but either way there's a story there, a true story buried in the soil of the Outer Banks or in the genetic code of descendants or in archaeological sites waiting to be excavated. We may never know the complete truth, but we can examine the evidence, consider the theories, and piece together the most likely scenarios. We can try to understand what happened to 115 people who disappeared into the American wilderness, leaving behind only questions and a single mysterious word. Croatoan. What did it mean? Where did they go? What happened to them? Let's explore the theories. Part 4. The theories. Theory 1, integration. Of all the theories about what happened to the lost colony, one stands out as the most logical, the most supported by evidence, and the most consistent with the single clue the colonists left behind. It's the theory that they did exactly what the carved word suggested. They went to Croatoan Island and integrated with the people. To understand this theory, we need to understand who the Croatoan people were and why the English colonists might have sought refuge with them. Croatoan was the name of both a tribe and an island. The island is known today as Hatteras Island, part of North Carolina's Outer Banks. It sits about 50 miles south of Roanoke, a barrier island separating the Atlantic Ocean from the Pamlico Sound. In the late 1500s, it was home to the Croatoan tribe, an Algonquian-speaking people who had lived on these islands for generations. The Croatoan people were not strangers to the English. In fact, they'd been allies since the first expeditions in the 1580s. When the initial exploratory voyages reached the Carolina coast, one of the Native Americans who traveled back to England was Montejo, a Croatoan man who learned English and served as an interpreter and intermediary between the two cultures. Montejo became a crucial bridge between worlds. He traveled to England twice, learned the language, understood English customs, and maintained friendly relations with the colonists. When John White's expedition arrived in 1587, Montejo was with them, returning home after years abroad. In August of that year, White baptized Montejo as a Christian and named him Lord of Roanoke and Dasamongapuk, essentially making him an English ally with official status. The Croatoan people, through Montejo, had remained consistently friendly toward the English even as other tribes grew hostile. They hadn't participated in the conflicts that plagued Ralph Lane's military expedition. They'd helped the colonists with food and information. They represented a safe haven in a region where the English had few friends. So when the colonists carved Croatoan into that post, they were directing anyone who came looking toward people who might actually help them. It wasn't a random destination. It was a logical choice, perhaps the only logical choice for vulnerable families who needed assistance to survive. But why would the colonists need to leave Roanoke at all? What would drive them to abandon the settlement they'd worked so hard to build? The answer becomes clear when we consider their situation. The colonists had limited supplies even before White left. They were supposed to receive reinforcements within months, but months turned to years, and no help came. They would have exhausted whatever they'd brought with them. Roanoke Island itself had limited resources. It was small, with poor soil for sustained agriculture and limited fresh water sources. The colonists couldn't support themselves indefinitely on that island alone. Moreover, they were in danger. Other tribes in the region had hostile relationships with the English following Ralph Lane's violent actions. The colonists were a small, vulnerable group surrounded by communities who had legitimate grievances against English settlers. Staying on Roanoke might have meant slow starvation or eventual conflict they couldn't win. The Croatoan people, on the other hand, offered protection, knowledge of the land, access to better resources, and a willingness to help. Moving to the island wasn't abandoning hope. It was a survival strategy. The colonists could live with the native tribe, learn from them, intermarry perhaps, and maintain their English identity while surviving in this new world. This theory suggests the colonists dismantled their houses carefully because they were salvaging materials to use elsewhere. They buried heavy iron objects because they planned to return for them, or because they were too cumbersome to transport but too valuable to leave exposed. They left personal items not out of panic, but because they could only carry so much in boats making multiple trips to Croatoan Island. So what evidence supports this theory? Quite a bit, actually, and it spans centuries. The most compelling evidence comes from reports made decades after the colonists vanished. When English settlers finally established successful colonies in Virginia in the early 1600s, they heard stories from Native Americans about survivors from Roanoke. In 1607, when Jamestown was founded, colonist William Strachey recorded accounts from the Powhatan people about English people living among the tribes to the south. These reports mentioned 7 Englishmen, 4 English boys, and numerous others who'd been integrated into tribal communities. In 1608, explorer John Smith, famous for his role in the Jamestown colony, heard similar accounts. Native Americans told him about people who wore clothing like the English, who had houses with stone walls, who used European tools, and who could speak English. These reports consistently pointed toward the southern coastal regions, the area where Croatoan Island lay. Even more intriguing are the reports from later explorers who encountered Native Americans with distinctly European physical characteristics in the Croatoan region. In the 1650s and beyond, visitors to the Outer Banks noted tribal members with gray eyes, light-colored hair, and skin tones that didn't match typical Native American populations of the region. Some of these individuals spoke English words, albeit broken English passed down through generations. The Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, who live inland from the Outer Banks, have long maintained oral traditions claiming descent from the lost colony. Many Lumbee individuals have surnames that match colonists from White's roster, surnames like Dare, Cooper, and others from the 1587 expedition. While oral tradition alone isn't proof, it's consistent with the integration theory. If the colonists married into the Croatoan tribe, their names and their genetic legacy would have been passed down through generations. Archaeological evidence has also emerged supporting this theory. On Hatteras Island, modern-day Croatoan, excavations have uncovered artifacts that suggest English presence in the late 16th century. A signet ring with a lion design, consistent with English craftsmanship from that era, was found in an area with both Native American and European artifacts mixed together. This mixing of material culture suggests people from different backgrounds living together, not conquest or conflict, but integration. Pieces of English pottery, sword parts, copper from English sources, all have been found in contexts that suggest they were incorporated into Native American communities. These weren't items from trade conducted at arm's length. They were personal possessions that ended up in living sites, suggesting the people who owned them were living among the tribes. More recently, modern genetic studies have attempted to trace potential lost colony DNA in modern Native American populations. While results have been inconclusive, too much time has passed. Populations have mixed too thoroughly. There are some intriguing hints that European genetic markers appear in populations descended from coastal Carolina tribes at higher rates than would be expected from later colonial contact alone. The integration theory also explains why no bodies were ever found at Roanoke. If the colonists died there from disease, starvation, or violence, there would be remains, graves, some archaeological evidence of death and burial. The complete absence of human remains suggests the colonists left alive, and presumably some survived long enough to establish themselves elsewhere. It explains the careful dismantling of the settlement. They weren't fleeing in panic. They were methodically salvaging useful materials, taking what they could carry, preserving what they couldn't, and leaving behind items that were too heavy or too damaged to be worth transporting. It explains why they carved Croatoan without the distress symbol. They weren't being forced to leave under attack. This was a planned relocation to a known, friendly destination. The message was meant to tell John White exactly where they'd gone, assuming he'd be able to follow. Of course, this theory doesn't answer every question. We don't know exactly when the colonists left Roanoke. Was it months after White departed? Years? Did they go all at once or in groups? Did all 115 make it to the island? Or did some die during the journey or shortly after arrival? We also don't know the full extent of their integration. Did they maintain a separate English community within the Croatoan tribe? Did they fully assimilate, adopting Native American customs and languages? Did their children grow up as English or as Croatoan? Did Eleanor Dare teach Virginia about her grandfather who sailed away? Or did Virginia grow up as a Croatoan child with only vague stories about English origins? The theory suggests that over time, the colonists and their descendants would have become indistinguishable from the tribe that took them in. First-generation colonists might have retained their English identity, but their children, born into a Native American community, would have been raised with one foot in each culture. By the third generation, the lost colonists would have been simply Croatoan people who happened to have some English ancestry. This slow fade into assimilation would explain why, when English colonists finally returned to the region decades later, they found only rumors and second-hand accounts. The people who had been John White's colonists were gone, replaced by their children and grandchildren who were culturally Croatoan, even if their family trees included English roots. There's something both sad and hopeful about this theory. Sad because it means John White never found his daughter and granddaughter, even though they might have survived. If Eleanor and Virginia lived with the Croatoan tribe, they were only 50 miles away from where White stood on that empty beach. If the storm hadn't come, if the anchors hadn't broken, if the captains had been willing to risk one more approach to the islands, he might have found them. But hopeful because it means the colonists didn't die in some terrible catastrophe. They survived. They adapted. They found help when they needed it most. They made the best of an impossible situation. Eleanor Dare might have raised Virginia among the Croatoan people, taught her to speak both English and Algonquian, blended two cultures in one family. Virginia might have grown up, married, had children of her own. The colony didn't end, it transformed. This theory is now considered the most likely explanation by many historians and archaeologists. It fits the evidence better than any alternative. It explains the carved message, the absence of bodies, the careful abandonment, and the later reports of English survivors among the tribes. It's consistent with what we know about the Croatoan people's friendly relationship with the English and with survival strategies that make sense for a small, vulnerable population in hostile territory. The lost colony might not have been lost at all. It might have been found by the Croatoan people who took in desperate families and gave them a chance to survive. The colonists vanished from English records, but they might have lived on in the bloodlines and oral traditions of the people who welcomed them. If this theory is correct, then Croatoan wasn't a mysterious clue pointing toward an unsolvable puzzle. It was a simple, straightforward message. We went to Croatoan. Come find us there. John White never did. But 400 years later, we might finally be understanding what happened to his family and the 115 people who carved that word before walking into a new life. Theory 2. Moved inland. While the integration with the native tribe seems like the most straightforward interpretation of the carved message, there's another theory that has gained significant support in recent years, particularly with new archaeological discoveries. This theory suggests that some or all of the colonists didn't go to Croatoan Island at all. Instead, they moved inland, away from the coast, to establish settlements in the interior of what we now call North Carolina. To understand this theory, we need to remember the original plan for the 1587 expedition. John White and his colonists were never supposed to settle permanently on Roanoke Island. Roanoke was meant to be only a temporary stop, a place to check on the men left behind from the previous expedition, to gather supplies and information, and then to move on. Their actual destination was supposed to be the Chesapeake Bay area, about 150 miles north of Roanoke. The Chesapeake region had several advantages over Roanoke Island. It had deeper harbors that could accommodate larger ships. It had better soil for agriculture. It had more reliable sources of fresh water. And it was home to tribes that earlier English explorers had reported as being relatively friendly and open to trade. But as we know, the pilot Simon Fernandez refused to take the colonists further north. He forced them to disembark at Roanoke and sailed away. The colonists found themselves stuck on an island they'd never intended to settle permanently. They made the best of it, but they must have always known Roanoke wasn't ideal. The island was small, isolated, and surrounded by communities who remembered Ralph Lane's violence. So here's the question. When the colonists finally decided they couldn't stay on Roanoke, why would they go to a small barrier island like Croatoan, rather than to the interior mainland, where resources were more abundant? The inland theory suggests that at least some of the colonists, perhaps all of them, made the journey to the interior. They might have traveled northwest toward the Chesapeake Bay area as originally planned, or they might have moved to sites along the Albemarle Sound, the Chowan River, or other locations that offered better long-term survival prospects than barrier islands. For many years, this was just speculation. Without physical evidence, historians could only guess about interior settlements based on scattered reports from Native Americans. But in 2012, everything changed with a remarkable discovery. Researchers at the First Colony Foundation were examining a map drawn by John White himself, the same John White who governed the colony. This map, housed in the British Museum, showed the coastal Carolina region in detail. White had created it during his time with the 1585 expedition, documenting the geography, Native American settlements, and other important features. When researchers examined the map using modern imaging technology, they discovered something hidden beneath a patch on the map. Someone had placed a small piece of paper over a specific location on the interior mainland, about 50 miles west of Roanoke Island. When conservators carefully lifted the patch, they found symbols underneath, symbols that appeared to mark a location of significance. The symbols suggested a fort or settlement. Why would White patch over this location? One theory is that the map was being prepared for publication, and White wanted to keep the colonists' planned inland refuge secret. He didn't want Spanish spies or hostile forces to know where the vulnerable settlers might relocate if they needed to leave Roanoke. This location became known as Site X, and it sparked an intensive archaeological investigation. The site is near the confluence of the Chowan River and the Albemarle Sound in Bertie County, North Carolina. It's about 50 miles inland from Roanoke, far enough to be safer from Spanish raids, but close enough to be reachable by the colonists. Beginning in 2013, archaeologists began excavating at Site X, and what they found was remarkable. Mixed in with Native American artifacts from the period were distinctly European objects, not trade goods that could have come through normal exchange, but personal items that suggested European people were living at this site. A piece of a gun, specifically a mechanism from a firearm that would have been cutting-edge technology in the 1580s. Borderware pottery, a type made in Surrey, England, near where many of the colonists originated. A food storage jar of European design. These weren't items from Jamestown colonists who arrived decades later. The context and dating suggested they were from the right time period, late 16th century, consistent with the lost colony era. And they weren't found in isolation. They were mixed in with Native American artifacts in what appeared to be a living site, suggesting integration or cohabitation. The archaeological team found evidence of what they called a contact site, a location where Europeans and Native Americans were living together or in close proximity. The European artifacts were few, which makes sense if we're talking about a small group of colonists who'd left most of their possessions behind on Roanoke. But they were present, and they were personal items, not just trade goods. This discovery lent credibility to the inland theory. It suggested that White had indeed identified potential inland refugees before he left, possibly even making arrangements with interior tribes. When the colonists needed to leave Roanoke, some or all of them might have traveled to this prearranged location. But Site X isn't the only evidence for an inland migration. Historical reports from the early 1600s also support this theory. When the Jamestown colony was established in Virginia in 1607, the English settlers heard numerous accounts from Native Americans about English survivors living among interior tribes. One particularly detailed report came from the Powhatan Confederation, which controlled a large territory in coastal Virginia. Chief Powhatan himself told the Jamestown colonists that he'd ordered the massacre of English people living among the Chesapeake tribe. According to Powhatan's account, these English people had been living peacefully with the Chesapeake tribe for years before he viewed them as a threat to his power and ordered their execution. Were these survivors from the lost colony? The timing would be right. The location would be right. The Chesapeake tribe lived in the very area where the colonists had originally planned to settle. Powhatan's account suggested these English people had been there long enough to establish homes and relationships, which fits with colonists who'd arrived in the late 1580s. Another report from Jamestown colonist William Strachey described English people living in two-story houses with stone walls among the tribes to the south and west. This suggests not just survival, but the establishment of permanent settlements with European-style architecture. These wouldn't be colonists barely hanging on. These would be people who'd successfully integrated and were building stable communities. The inland theory also makes practical sense when we consider survival strategies. Barrier islands like Croatoan, while safer from immediate military threats, have limited resources. Fresh water can be scarce. Agricultural land is minimal. Storms can devastate island communities. The interior mainland, by contrast, offered rich soil, abundant fresh water, extensive forests for timber and game, and established Native American communities with sophisticated agricultural systems. If the colonists were thinking long-term, not just about surviving a few months until rescue, but about building a life in the New World, moving inland makes more sense than staying on barrier islands. They could establish farms, build permanent structures, and integrate with tribes that had the knowledge and resources to support them. This theory also explains why the search for the colonists has been so difficult. If they scattered across the interior, integrating with different tribes at different locations, there wouldn't be a single lost colony to find. Instead, there would be small groups spread across hundreds of miles of territory, each blending into their host communities at different rates. Some colonists might have gone to Croatoan Island, as the carved message indicated. Others might have traveled to Site X or other interior locations. Still others might have moved even further, to the Chesapeake Bay area as originally planned. The colony could have fragmented into multiple groups, each seeking survival in different locations with different Native American communities. Recent DNA studies have attempted to trace lost colony genetics in modern populations. While results are inconclusive due to the passage of time and extensive population mixing, some researchers have found higher than expected European genetic markers in populations descended from interior North Carolina tribes. This could support the theory that colonists moved inland and had children with Native American partners, passing their genes down through generations. The inland theory doesn't contradict the Croatoan theory. It complements it. Both could be true. Some colonists could have gone to Croatoan Island, while others moved inland. Or the entire colony could have initially moved to Croatoan, then later fragmented, with some groups traveling to interior locations for better resources and opportunities. What makes this theory particularly compelling is that it explains why John White never found his family, even though they'd left him a clear message. If the colonists intended to go to Croatoan but later moved inland, the carved word would have pointed White in the wrong direction, or at least to only the first step of a longer journey he was never able to complete. Eleanor Dare might have lived at Croatoan for a time, then traveled inland with Virginia and other colonists to establish a more permanent settlement. She might have raised her daughter in a Native American village along the Chowan River or near the Chesapeake Bay. Virginia Dare might have grown up not on a barrier island, but in the interior forests, learning to speak Algonquian languages, marrying into a tribe, becoming part of the complex tapestry of cultures that made up early American history. The inland theory reminds us that the colonists had agency in their fate. They weren't passive victims waiting to be rescued or destroyed. They were resourceful people who made strategic decisions about where to go and how to survive. Moving inland wasn't abandoning hope. It was actively pursuing a better future. Archaeological work continues at Site X and at other potential locations throughout the Carolina interior. Every artifact discovered, every analysis completed, every piece of evidence examined brings us closer to understanding where the colonists went and what happened to them. The mystery isn't fully solved, but the inland theory, supported by archaeological evidence, historical reports, and practical logic, suggests that at least some of the lost colonists weren't lost at all. They simply walked further into the wilderness than anyone thought to look for them. Theory 3. The dark possibilities. Not all theories about the lost colony end with survival and integration. Some historians and researchers have proposed much darker explanations for what happened to the 115 colonists who vanished from Roanoke Island. These theories suggest violence, disease, or catastrophe, scenarios where few or none of the colonists survived. These darker possibilities have captured the popular imagination for centuries. They appear in novels, films, and television shows, often presented as the most likely explanation. But when we examine the evidence, or more accurately, the lack of evidence, These theories become much harder to support. Let's explore them one by one. The Spanish attack theory has been proposed by numerous historians over the years. Spain was England's primary rival in the New World. Spanish explorers had claimed vast territories in the Americas, and they viewed English settlements as illegal intrusions on Spanish land. King Philip II had sent the Armada to invade England in 1588, demonstrating his willingness to use military force against English interests. Spanish ships regularly patrolled the Atlantic coastline, protecting their trade routes from pirates and privateers. They knew about the English settlement at Roanoke. Spanish intelligence had reported on it. Some historians have suggested that Spanish forces located the colony and destroyed it, killing or capturing all the colonists to eliminate the English presence. This theory would explain the complete disappearance. It would explain why the settlement was carefully dismantled. Perhaps the Spanish salvaged useful materials. It might even explain the carved word Croatoan. Perhaps it was misdirection, carved by survivors trying to throw pursuers off their trail, or carved by Spanish forces to confuse later English searchers. But here's the problem. There's no evidence. No Spanish records document an attack on Roanoke, and the Spanish were meticulous record keepers, especially about military actions. They documented their raids on other settlements, their battles, their captures. If they'd eliminated an entire English colony, they would have reported it to their superiors. Such an action would have been seen as a victory worth recording. Moreover, the physical evidence at Roanoke doesn't support a violent attack. There were no bodies, no mass grave, no signs of battle, no weapon marks on the remaining structures, no evidence of fire damage from an attack, no scattered remains of a settlement destroyed in conflict. The careful dismantling of houses and the buried iron objects suggest planning and time, not the aftermath of a sudden assault. If Spanish forces had attacked, we'd expect to find evidence, bodies that weren't given proper burial, destruction, debris, something. The absence of such evidence makes this theory unlikely. Another dark theory involves violence from hostile Native American tribes. We know that the colonists had tense relationships with several tribes in the region. Ralph Lane's violence during the 1585 expedition had created lasting enmity. George Howe had been killed shortly after White's colonists arrived. Some historians suggest that the tribes eventually decided to eliminate the English presence entirely. The most specific version of this theory involves the Powhatan Confederation. Chief Powhatan, who later interacted with the Jamestown colonists, claimed in the early 1600s that he'd ordered the massacre of English people living among the Chesapeake tribe. Some researchers believe these were survivors from Roanoke who'd moved north to the Chesapeake Bay area, only to be killed years later when Powhatan viewed them as a threat. This theory has more supporting evidence than the Spanish attack theory. We have Powhatan's own testimony. We know there were tensions between the English and various tribes. We know that conflict was common during this period of early contact. A massacre is certainly possible. But again, the physical evidence at Roanoke doesn't support a violent attack there. The settlement wasn't destroyed in battle. It was carefully dismantled. If the colonists were killed after they left Roanoke, perhaps at Croatoan or inland, that would explain the absence of bodies at the original settlement. But it doesn't explain the orderly abandonment or the carved message. Disease is another dark possibility that historians have considered. European and Native American populations had different immunities. Europeans carried diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza that could devastate Native American communities who'd never been exposed. Conversely, Europeans could fall victim to diseases endemic to the Americas. Perhaps the colonists were struck by an epidemic. Illness could have spread quickly through their small community, killing most or all of them within weeks or months. The survivors, if any, might have been too weak or too few to maintain the settlement. They might have attempted to reach Croatoan or another location, but died along the way. This theory has some merit. Disease was a constant threat in early colonial settlements. We know that illness decimated many early American colonies. The Jamestown settlement, established 20 years later, nearly failed due to disease and starvation in its first years. Disease doesn't discriminate. It can kill entire communities, regardless of their preparations or intentions. But once again, we face the same critical question. Where are the bodies? If disease killed the colonists at Roanoke, there should be graves, even if the survivors tried to bury their dead properly. There should be some archaeological evidence of mass burial. If they died so quickly that burial wasn't possible, there should be remains scattered around the settlement. The complete absence of human remains at Roanoke is one of the most significant pieces of evidence we have. It strongly suggests the colonists left the island alive. Disease might have struck them later, after they'd relocated, but not at Roanoke itself. Starvation is closely related to the disease theory. The colonists had limited supplies. They'd arrived late in the season and missed most of the planting window. They were depending on trade with Native Americans for food, but those relationships were strained. Without John White's promised supplies, they might have faced slow starvation during their first winter. Starvation weakens communities in terrible ways. It makes people susceptible to disease. It leads to poor decision-making. It can cause social breakdown as desperate people compete for scarce resources. Perhaps the colonists died slowly of hunger, and the survivors, too weak to maintain the settlement, attempted to reach help but died in the attempt. This is plausible. Many early colonial ventures failed due to inadequate food supplies. The colonists were not experienced farmers or hunters. They were largely tradesmen and gentlemen who'd never had to produce their own food. Learning to survive in an unfamiliar environment takes time they might not have had. But again, the evidence doesn't quite fit. If the colonists were starving at Roanoke, why did they have the strength and time to carefully dismantle their houses? Why bury iron objects with such care? Starving, desperate people don't typically engage in methodical deconstruction. They huddle in whatever shelter remains, burning furniture for warmth, unable to plan or act strategically. The organized nature of the abandonment suggests the colonists still had enough resources and strength to plan and execute a relocation. They weren't in the final stages of starvation when they left. That doesn't mean they didn't face hunger later, but it suggests they left Roanoke while still capable of making rational decisions. There's another dark possibility that combines several factors. The colony could have fragmented under stress, with different groups meeting different fates. Perhaps internal conflict arose as resources dwindled and hope faded. Some colonists might have wanted to stay and wait for White's return. Others might have wanted to seek help from Native Americans. Still others might have wanted to try reaching other English settlements or Spanish territories. If the colony splintered, different groups could have met different ends. Some might have successfully integrated with tribes. Others might have died from disease or starvation. Still others might have been killed in conflicts. This would explain why the evidence is so confusing and contradictory. There might not be a single answer because there wasn't a single fate. This theory has the advantage of not requiring all 115 people to have the same experience. Real life is messy. Groups of desperate people often make different choices. Some colonists were related by blood or marriage and might have stayed together. Others were single men who might have struck out on their own or in small groups. Families with young children would have made different decisions than childless couples. But this theory, like the others, struggles with the lack of physical evidence of disaster. If multiple groups met violent ends in different locations, we'd expect to find at least some evidence somewhere. Archaeological remains, mass graves, scattered artifacts at sites of conflict. The fact that we haven't found clear evidence of catastrophe at any location suggests that wholesale death was not the primary outcome. The dark theories persist because they're dramatic. They fit our expectations about how dangerous early colonial life was. They align with the stories we know about other failed settlements. And there's a certain fatalism to them that feels appropriately tragic for such a mysterious disappearance. But the evidence, such as it is, points away from catastrophe and toward survival. The organized abandonment, the carved message, the lack of bodies, the later reports of English people living among tribes, the archaeological finds suggesting integration rather than destruction. All of this suggests that while the colonists' story wasn't easy, it wasn't necessarily a tale of mass death. That doesn't mean none of the colonists died. Certainly some did. Early colonial life was brutal, and survival rates were low. But the dark theories that suggest total annihilation of the colony are the least supported by the evidence we have. The colonists faced terrible challenges. They were abandoned by circumstances, cut off from help, struggling in an unfamiliar environment, with limited resources and few friends. Their story is tragic, not because they all died in some dramatic catastrophe, but because they were forgotten. They survived long enough to leave messages, to make plans, to execute an organized relocation. And then they disappeared into the historical record, their ultimate fate lost to time. That's perhaps a more haunting ending than any violent catastrophe could be. Theory 4. Multiple fates. Perhaps the most realistic theory about the lost colony is also the most complex. The colonists didn't all go to the same place or meet the same fate. Instead, the group of 115 people fragmented, with different groups making different choices and experiencing different outcomes. This theory acknowledges something important about human behavior under extreme stress. People don't always agree on the best course of action. What looks like a single mystery might actually be several different stories that happen to start at the same place. Think about the composition of the colony. These weren't 115 identical people with identical needs and priorities. They were families, single men, married couples, children, elderly individuals, tradesmen, gentlemen, pregnant women, and newborns. Each person or family unit would have faced unique challenges and would have had different capabilities for survival. A family with young children would need to prioritize stability and safety. They couldn't risk dangerous journeys or experimental relocations. They needed to be near established communities with reliable food sources. A young, single man, on the other hand, might be willing to take risks, to explore inland territories, to strike out for the Chesapeake Bay, to try reaching other English settlements or even Spanish territories where he might be taken prisoner but at least survive. The elderly or infirm colonists couldn't have made difficult overland journeys. They would have needed to stay close to Roanoke or move only to nearby locations like Croatoan Island. But younger, healthier colonists might have been capable of trekking 50 or more miles inland to establish new settlements in better locations. So when we look at the carved word Croatoan, we shouldn't necessarily assume it was a message about where everyone went. It might have been a message about where one group went, perhaps the largest group, or the group that included John White's family, or simply the last group to leave. Other groups might have already departed for different destinations, leaving no message because they weren't following the agreed-upon plan. The evidence we've discussed in previous theories actually supports this fragmentation hypothesis quite well. Reports from the early 1600s mentioned English survivors in multiple locations, some on Croatoan, some among interior tribes, some with the Chesapeake people far to the north. Rather than assuming all these reports were about the same group of colonists moving around, what if they were about different groups that had separated years earlier? The archaeological evidence also suggests multiple destinations. Site X, 50 miles inland, shows signs of European presence. Hatteras Island, Croatoan, has yielded English artifacts from the right time period. Other sites throughout coastal North Carolina have produced tantalizing hints of European contact in the late 16th century. Rather than trying to force all this evidence to point to a single location, what if it's telling us the colonists spread out across the region? Let's imagine how this might have unfolded. In the months after John White departed in 1587, the colonists struggled through their first winter. They rationed supplies. They traded with Native Americans when possible. They waited for White's return. But as winter turned to spring and spring to summer, and no ships appeared on the horizon, they had to face reality. Help wasn't coming soon. They needed a new plan. Discussions would have taken place, arguments certainly. Some colonists might have advocated for staying put, maintaining the settlement, believing that White would eventually return and they needed to be there when he did. Others might have argued that Roanoke was unsustainable long-term, that they needed better land, better water, better relationships with the local tribes. Perhaps Manteo, the Croatoan intermediary, offered to take families back to his home island. That would be the safest option for those unable or unwilling to attempt longer journeys. Croatoan Island wasn't far. The journey could be made in boats. The Croatoan people were friendly and had resources to share. For families with young children like Eleanor and Ananias Dare with baby Virginia, this might have seemed like the best choice, but others might have remembered the original plan, to settle in the Chesapeake Bay area. Some colonists might have organized an expedition north, following the coast or traveling by water, hoping to reach the region where they'd always intended to establish themselves. These might have been younger men, perhaps some families without small children, willing to risk the journey for the potential reward of better land. Still others might have made contact with interior tribes and received offers of sanctuary. The location marked as Site X on John White's map might have been known to some colonists as a potential refuge. A group could have traveled inland, following rivers, guided by Native Americans, to establish themselves in communities far from the coast and far from the dangers of Spanish raids or English conflicts with coastal tribes. And it's possible some colonists died before any of these relocations happened. Disease could have claimed lives during that first winter. Accidents could have occurred. The colony might have started with 115 people, but had fewer when the decision to leave finally came. The colonists who went to Croatoan might have carved the message, or perhaps those who stayed behind longest carved it before finally leaving themselves. The word Croatoan became the primary clue, but it might have represented only one piece of a more complex story. This theory of multiple fates explains why the historical record is so confusing. Early reports from the Jamestown colonists in the 1600s describe English survivors in different locations with different stories. Rather than being contradictory, these reports might all be accurate. They're just describing different groups of people who made different choices decades earlier. It explains why no single archaeological site has yielded conclusive evidence of the entire colony, because the entire colony wasn't in any single location. The artifacts are scattered because the people were scattered. It explains why genetic evidence is ambiguous. If colonists integrated with different tribes across a wide geographic area, their genetic legacy would be diffused through multiple populations rather than concentrated in one community. Tracing that ancestry becomes exponentially more difficult. This theory also respects the complexity of human decision-making. Real people facing real crises don't make uniform choices. They debate, they disagree, they fragment into groups based on relationships, priorities, and capabilities. The Lost Colony wasn't a single unified entity that moved as one. It was a community of individuals and families, each trying to survive in whatever way seemed best to them. Eleanor Dare might have taken Virginia to Croatoan Island, seeking safety with Manteo's people. Another family might have traveled inland to Site X. A group of young men might have headed north toward Chesapeake Bay. Some elderly colonists might have stayed on Roanoke longer than others, too frail to travel, eventually dying there, though their remains have never been found. Each group would have had its own story. Some might have successfully integrated with Native American communities, their descendants living on in tribal populations. Others might have perished from disease, starvation, or violence. Still others might have been absorbed so completely into their host communities that within a generation or two their English origins were forgotten entirely. This is perhaps the most honest theory because it acknowledges uncertainty. We can't point to a single location and say, here's where the lost colony went, because there probably isn't a single location. We can't say definitively what happened to every colonist because different things happen to different people. The mystery of Roanoke isn't just one mystery. It's 115 individual mysteries bound together by a single starting point. The colonists began their journey together, but they likely ended it in different places in different ways with different outcomes. And perhaps that's why the mystery has endured for so long. We keep looking for a single answer when the truth might be that there are many answers scattered across the landscape and lost to time. Part 5. The Legacy. Modern Investigations. For over 400 years, the lost colony remained exactly that, lost. The story became legend, the subject of speculation and myth, with little hard evidence to guide researchers toward the truth. But in recent decades, advances in archaeology, genetics, and technology have opened new possibilities for solving this centuries-old mystery. Modern investigations into the lost colony began in earnest in the late 20th century, but it's the 21st century discoveries that have truly transformed our understanding. Today, multiple research teams are working across North Carolina, using cutting-edge technology to search for traces of the colonists. And they're finding things, small things, often fragments and hints rather than definitive answers. But each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle. The story of modern investigation really begins in 2012 with a map hidden in plain sight for centuries. Researchers at the First Colony Foundation were examining John White's map of the Carolina coast, the same map White had drawn during the 1585 expedition. This wasn't a new discovery. The map had been housed in the British Museum for hundreds of years, studied by countless historians, but no one had looked closely enough at one particular detail. Using modern imaging technology, conservators noticed something odd. There was a small patch on the map, a tiny piece of paper covering a specific location on the interior mainland. Patches weren't unusual on old maps. Cartographers often made corrections, updating maps as they received new information. But when researchers carefully examined this patch using infrared photography and other techniques, they could see what was hidden underneath. Beneath the patch were symbols indicating a fort or settlement, located about 50 miles west of Roanoke Island. The location was inland, away from the coast, near the Chowan River and Albemarle Sound. Why would White hide this location? The most likely explanation is that he didn't want to reveal the colonists' potential refuge to anyone who might obtain the map: Spanish spies, hostile forces, or simply rivals who might interfere with English colonial efforts. This discovery, which researchers dubbed Site X, launched an immediate archaeological investigation. If White had marked this location as significant enough to hide, it might be where the colonists planned to relocate. It might be where they actually went. Beginning in 2013, archaeologists from the First Colony Foundation began excavating at Site X. The site was on private property in Bertie County, North Carolina, in an area that showed no obvious signs of colonial presence. They were essentially searching through rural farmland for traces of people who'd been there more than 400 years ago. What they found exceeded their expectations. Mixed with Native American artifacts from the late 16th century were distinctly European objects: a small brass fitting from a firearm, pieces of borderware pottery, a type manufactured in Surrey, England, a rapier sword handle, food storage containers of European design. These weren't trade goods that could have passed through multiple hands. These were personal items, the kind of things colonists would have brought with them and used in daily life. The context was crucial. These European artifacts weren't in a separate settlement area. They were mixed with Native American materials in what appeared to be a shared living site. This suggested integration, not conquest. Europeans and Native Americans living together, sharing space, blending their material cultures. It was exactly what you'd expect to find if colonists had joined a Native American community and been welcomed to live among them. The dating of these artifacts placed them in the right time period, late 16th century, consistent with the Lost Colony era. The location matched White's hidden marking, and the pattern of European and Native American artifacts mixed together supported the integration theory that many historians had proposed. But Site X wasn't the only location yielding discoveries. On Hatteras Island, the former Croatoan island where the carved message said the colonists went, other archaeological teams were making their own findings. The Croatoan Archaeological Project, led by researchers from the University of Bristol and other institutions, has been excavating on Hatteras Island for years. They've uncovered a wealth of artifacts from a Native American settlement that was clearly in contact with Europeans during the late 16th century. A signet ring bearing a lion design, consistent with English craftsmanship from the period. Pieces of English pottery, copper artifacts that trace back to European sources, iron tools of European manufacture. What makes these findings significant is how they're distributed. The English artifacts aren't concentrated in one area, as they would be if they'd been brought as trade goods and stored together. They're scattered throughout the Native American living sites, mixed with local pottery, tools, and other materials. This pattern suggests English people were living there, using these items in their daily lives alongside the Croatoan people. One particularly intriguing find was a small writing slate, the kind an English child might use to practice letters and numbers. It was found in a context suggesting it had been used at the site, not just traded and stored away. Did an English child, perhaps Virginia Dare herself, live on this island, learning to write while also learning the language and customs of the Croatoan people. Beyond specific artifacts, modern archaeology employs techniques that weren't available to earlier researchers. Ground-penetrating radar can detect buried structures and disturbances in the soil without excavation. Magnetometry can locate metal objects buried deep underground. LIDAR technology, laser imaging from aircraft, can reveal landscape features and potential archaeological sites hidden by centuries of forest growth. These technologies have identified dozens of sites across coastal North Carolina that show promise for future investigation. Each site requires careful excavation and analysis, a process that takes years. But the accumulating evidence from multiple locations supports the theory that the colonists spread out across the region rather than staying in a single settlement. Genetic research has added another dimension to modern investigations. DNA analysis offers the possibility of tracing lost colony ancestry in modern populations. If the colonists integrated with Native American tribes and had children, their genetic legacy should still exist in descendants of those tribes. Several research projects have attempted to identify lost colony DNA in modern Native American populations, particularly the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, who have long claimed descent from the colonists. The results have been intriguing but not conclusive. Some studies have found European genetic markers in populations descended from North Carolina tribes at rates higher than would be expected from later colonial contact alone. But 400 years is a long time. Populations have mixed extensively. Genetic drift, migration, and intermarriage with later European settlers have blurred the signals researchers are looking for. More recent genetic studies have focused on mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome analysis, which can trace maternal and paternal lineages respectively. These studies have identified some genetic signatures consistent with late 16th century English populations in families that claim lost colony descent. But establishing definitive proof remains elusive. The genetic evidence suggests possible connections, but doesn't provide the kind of clear, undeniable proof that would solve the mystery definitively. Still, the accumulation of genetic, archaeological, and historical evidence creates a compelling picture. Modern investigations have moved the lost colony from the realm of pure mystery into the realm of solvable historical questions. We may never know the fate of every individual colonist, but we're building a much clearer understanding of what likely happened. Current research continues at multiple sites. Universities, private foundations, and government agencies are funding ongoing excavations. Each field season brings new discoveries, sometimes dramatic, often subtle, always adding to our knowledge. A fragment of pottery here, a tool there, soil disturbances that suggest structures, charcoal that can be radiocarbon dated to provide precise timelines. Modern researchers also have access to historical documents that earlier investigators missed or couldn't access. Archives in England, Spain, and other countries are being digitized and made searchable. Historians are discovering references to the lost colony in unexpected places. Marginalia in ship's logs, mentions in letters, administrative records that seemed unrelated but contain valuable information. The combination of all these approaches, archaeology, genetics, historical research, and advanced technology, is gradually illuminating what happened at Roanoke. The picture that's emerging isn't simple. The colonists didn't all go to one place and have one fate. They scattered, they integrated, they adapted. Some survived and some didn't. But the survivors left traces that modern science is finally sophisticated enough to detect and interpret. One of the most important contributions of modern investigations is shifting how we think about the lost colony. For centuries, it was framed as a mystery of disappearance, as though the colonists simply vanished into thin air. But modern research reveals it as a story of adaptation and survival. The colonists didn't disappear, they transformed. They became something new, blending English and Native American identities, creating families and communities that carried forward aspects of both cultures. This is a more complex story than simple disappearance, but it's also more human. It's about real people making difficult choices, finding ways to survive in impossible circumstances, adapting to new realities while trying to maintain connections to their identities and their pasts. The work continues. Archaeological teams will return to the field next season and the season after that. Genetic researchers will refine their techniques, looking for clearer signals in the DNA of modern populations. Historians will continue mining archives for new documents. Technology will advance, offering new ways to detect and analyze evidence. The lost colony may never be fully found in the sense of discovering a single settlement, with clear evidence of every colonist's fate. But modern investigations have already accomplished something remarkable. They've transformed an unsolvable mystery into an answerable question. We're learning what happened. Slowly, piece by piece, the story is being recovered from the soil and the genetic code and the historical record. 400 years after John White found that empty settlement, we're finally beginning to understand where the colonists went and what became of them. Why we're still obsessed. 430-plus years have passed since John White found that empty settlement. Entire civilizations have risen and fallen in that time. Technologies that would seem like magic to the colonists are now mundane parts of our daily lives. The world has changed in ways the Roanoke settlers couldn't have imagined. So why do we still care about 115 people who disappeared from a small island in 1590? Why does this particular colonial failure haunt us when dozens of other early settlements failed and were forgotten? The answer lies partly in timing. Roanoke was England's first serious attempt to establish a permanent colony in North America. It was the beginning of what would become the United States. Every American child learns about the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock in 1620, about Jamestown in 1607. But before any of those settlements, there was Roanoke. It was the first chapter of English America, and that first chapter ended with a mystery that was never solved. There's something deeply unsettling about an unresolved beginning. We want origin stories to be clear and triumphant. We want to know how things started, who our ancestors were, what struggles they overcame. The lost colony denies us that clarity. Instead of a foundation story we can celebrate, we have a question mark at the very beginning of American history. But it's more than just chronology. The lost colony endures because it's intensely human. This wasn't an abstract historical event. It was families. Real people with names and relationships and hopes for the future. We know their names from the colonial records. Eleanor Dare, Virginia Dare, Ananias Dare, George Howe, Marjorie Harvey. Names attached to real individuals who loved and feared and dreamed just as we do. And at the center of the story is a tragedy we can all understand. A father forced to leave his family and unable to return. John White's anguish resonates across centuries. Every parent understands the horror of being separated from your children, of not knowing if they're safe, of being helpless to protect them. White's 3 years of desperate attempts to return, his failures, his final discovery of the empty settlement, These are elements of nightmare that transcend historical period. The baby makes it even more poignant. Virginia Dare, born just days before her grandfather sailed away, the first English child born in America, a symbol of hope and new beginnings, and then vanished. We don't know if she lived to be a toddler or grew to adulthood or died in infancy. That uncertainty, that lack of closure, keeps us wondering, what happened to the baby? It's a question that touches something primal in us. The word itself, Croatoan, has taken on an almost mythical quality. 8 letters carved in wood have become one of the most famous, unsolved clues in history. The word appears in literature, television shows, films, and countless works of fiction. It's been used as a symbol of mystery, of messages from the past, of questions without answers. Part of Croatoan's power is its ambiguity. It's both clear and unclear. It points to a specific location, which should make it a straightforward clue. But the location didn't yield the colonists when White tried to reach it, and hasn't yielded definitive answers in the 4 centuries since. The word promised a solution, but delivered only deeper mystery. It's simultaneously an answer and a question, which makes it endlessly fascinating. There's also something haunting about carved messages. Writing meant to be permanent, meant to last, meant to be found. The colonists took time to carve those letters deep into wood. They wanted to communicate across time. And we found the message. We just can't fully understand what it means or what happened after it was carved. It's like receiving a letter from the past that's just cryptic enough to frustrate every attempt at interpretation. The mystery also speaks to our fascination with survival stories. We want to know how people cope with extreme circumstances. How do you survive when your supplies run out, when help doesn't come, when you're stranded in an unfamiliar place with limited resources? The colonists faced those questions in the most acute way possible. Their answers, whatever they were, represent human adaptability and resilience, or they represent tragic failure, not knowing which is part of what keeps us engaged. There's a frontier aspect to the story that resonates with American identity. The colonists were on the edge of the known world, trying to build something new in a place that challenged everything they knew. That pioneering spirit, that willingness to venture into uncertainty for the possibility of something better, became central to American mythology. The Lost Colony embodies both the courage of that venture and the very real dangers it entailed. The mystery also represents a cultural collision that would define American history. Europeans and Native Americans meeting, trying to understand each other, sometimes cooperating, sometimes conflicting. The colonists' likely integration with Native American tribes tells a story about adaptation and cultural blending that complicates simpler narratives of conquest or conflict. It suggests that early American history was more nuanced, more complex than we sometimes acknowledge. We're also drawn to mysteries we think we might solve. Unlike truly ancient mysteries where all the principles are long dead and all physical evidence has crumbled, the Lost Colony feels tantalizingly recent. 400 years is a long time, but not impossibly long. Artifacts survive. Genetic evidence might exist. Documents might be discovered in archives. Every few years, new evidence emerges that seems to bring us closer to answers. That possibility of resolution keeps researchers and amateur historians engaged. Modern technology has made the mystery feel more solvable than ever. We have tools that John White couldn't have imagined. Ground-penetrating radar, DNA sequencing, satellite imaging, chemical analysis of artifacts. Each technological advance brings hope that this will be the breakthrough that finally solves the puzzle. The mystery is old, but the methods we're using to investigate it are cutting edge, and that contrast is compelling. There's also something democratic about historical mysteries. You don't need a PhD to have theories about the lost colony. Amateur historians, genealogists, curious readers, anyone can examine the evidence and develop their own interpretation. The mystery invites participation. It doesn't belong to experts alone. That accessibility makes it a public fascination rather than just an academic question. The lost colony also represents loss in a very pure sense. These people are lost to us. Their stories, their experiences, their voices, all gone. We live in an age where everything is documented, where digital footprints follow us everywhere. The idea that 115 people could simply vanish without leaving clear evidence of their fate is both foreign and fascinating. It reminds us that not everything is knowable, that some stories slipped through the cracks of history and are lost forever. Yet we resist that loss. We keep searching, keep theorizing, keep hoping that the next archaeological dig or genetic study or archival discovery will finally tell us what happened. That persistence in the face of centuries of uncertainty says something about human nature. We need closure. We need answers. We need to know. The lost colony matters because it's more than just a historical curiosity. It's a story about family and loss, about courage and adaptation, about the meeting of cultures, about the fragility of human endeavors and the resilience of human spirits, about messages sent across time and the enduring human desire to understand our past. 400 years later, we're still searching for John White's family. We're still trying to solve a mystery carved in wood on an empty island. We're still obsessed because at its heart, this isn't just about history. It's about us, about how we face the unknown, how we survive when everything falls apart, how we remember those who came before us. And as long as questions remain, we'll keep searching for answers. In closing, we'll probably never know the complete truth about what happened to the lost colony of Roanoke. Too much time has passed. Too many voices have been silenced. Too much evidence has been lost to weather, decay, and the simple passage of centuries. But we know more now than we ever have before. The accumulated evidence from archaeology, genetics, and historical research points toward a likely scenario. The colonists didn't vanish into thin air. They didn't die in some sudden catastrophe. They made choices. They adapted. They sought help from people who knew this land better than they did. Most likely, the colonists left Roanoke Island because they had no other choice. John White didn't return. Supplies ran out. The island couldn't sustain them, so they dismantled their houses, buried what they couldn't carry, and carved a message for anyone who came looking. Then they left, some to Croatoan Island, some to the interior, perhaps small groups heading to different destinations, each seeking the best chance for survival. They likely integrated with Native American communities, English families joining Croatoan villages, colonists learning new languages, new skills, new ways of surviving in this land. Children born from unions between English and Native American parents. Cultures blending slowly over generations until the distinction between colonist and tribe member became meaningless. Eleanor Dare probably raised Virginia somewhere in this new world. Whether on Croatoan Island or at an interior settlement, whether her daughter grew up speaking English or Algonquian or both, we can't know. But the evidence suggests they survived, at least for a time. That baby, who was born on August 18th, 1587, likely had a life, brief or long, easy or hard, but a life nonetheless. John White never found them. That's the tragedy at the heart of the story. He tried. For 3 years he fought against obstacles, made desperate attempts, pulled every string he could reach, and when he finally made it back to Roanoke, he was too late. They were gone. The storm that kept him from Croatoan Island was the final cruel twist in a series of misfortunes that defined those 3 years. White died not knowing. That lack of closure must have been unbearable. To have been within 50 miles of his family and unable to reach them. To have found the message they left, but never been able to follow it. To spend his final years wondering if Eleanor and Virginia were alive somewhere, or if they'd died while he was helplessly stranded in England. But maybe, in a way, the colonists succeeded. They came to the New World to build new lives, to become part of this land. If they integrated with Native American tribes, if their children and grandchildren carried forward mixed heritage and mixed cultures, then they didn't fail. They just succeeded in a way nobody expected. The word Croatoan still stands as the central mystery. Those 8 letters carved in wood have echoed through 4 centuries of American history. They were meant to be a simple message, "We went here," but became instead a symbol of all the questions we can't answer, all the stories we've lost, all the voices that time has silenced. Somewhere on the outer banks of North Carolina, Roanoke Island sleeps under stars the colonists once watched. The fort they built is long gone, returned to forest and marsh. Hatteras Island stretches south along the coast, its beaches still shaped by the same tides that brought settlers to these shores in 1587. The word carved in wood has long since rotted away, but the mystery it created remains, passed down through 400 years of wondering. And here, wherever you are, you're safe in your bed or your chair or wherever you've chosen to rest. The people you love are findable. The messages you send reach their destinations. Whatever troubles brought you here tonight seem perhaps a little smaller now, placed in the context of historical mystery and the passage of centuries. Your problems are real, but so's your presence. You're here. You know where your family is. You made it through today. The story fades now into the background. Just another tale of human adaptation and loss, of messages across time and our eternal need to understand them. The colonists left a clue, but the clue itself became the mystery. Sometimes the answers we seek are buried too deep, scattered too wide, lost too long ago, and sometimes that's okay. Not everything needs to be solved to matter. You've walked with John White through that empty settlement. You've stood before the carved word. You've considered the theories and the evidence and the possibilities. You've carried 115 names through their story. But now the story has been told, and you can release it back into history where it belongs. Tomorrow you'll wake to your own mysteries, your own unanswered questions, your own carved words waiting to be interpreted. But tonight, let them wait. Tonight is for rest. Close your eyes. Let the island fade. Let the colonists walk into the forest one final time. Let the word Croatoan blur and soften until it's just letters, just sounds, just echoes from a distant shore. They left their message. We found it. That's enough. Sleep now. Let the mystery rest, and rest with it. The search is over for tonight.